It was a shock for us. I mean, when I heard yesterday, it couldn't sink in. I thought, it can't be. I only had a text off him the day before. It just seemed unreal, you know.
They were the godfathers of heavy metal, the guitar genius who built the sound, and the wild frontman who gave it a soul. For decades, the world saw Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne as untouchable rock icon, larger than life, unbreakable, unstoppable. Behind the thunder of the riffs and the chaos of the headlines was something no one ever truly saw, a friendship forged in the backstreets of Birmingham, torn apart by fame, addiction, and time, yet somehow strong enough to find its way back. And in the end, when the lights faded and the noise stopped, Tony would break his silence, revealing the truth about Ozzy that no camera ever caught and no fan ever imagined. A truth so personal, so raw, it would forever change the way the world remembers the Prince of Darkness. Long before the stadiums, the platinum records, and the chaos of rock and roll, Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne were just two kids growing up in Birmingham, England, a city of smoke, steel, and hard work. It wasn't a place where dreams of fame were supposed to survive. But somehow, these two did more than dream. They built an entire genre. In the late 60s, they formed a scrappy little group called the Polka Tulk Blues Band, a name even they didn't take seriously. After a few lineup changes and a short stint as Earth, they found a new identity, Black Sabbath. The name came from a horror movie playing across the street from their rehearsal space, and with it came a sound the world had never heard before, slow, heavy, dark, and dripping with atmosphere. The early days weren't glamorous. They played in cramped pubs where the crowd barely looked up from their drinks. Money was so tight they used second-hand guitars and worn-out amps that buzzed more than they sang. There were moments they nearly gave up, but then, in 1970, lightning struck. Their self-titled debut, Black Sabbath, hit like a thunderclap, eerie, raw, and impossible to ignore. Critics didn't know what to make of it, but fans did. Then came Paranoid, and suddenly the boys from Birmingham were at the center of a musical revolution. Heavy metal had been born, but along with fame came something else, a bond between Tony and Ozzy that went beyond music. They weren't just bandmates. They were brothers in every way that mattered, a bond that would face tests neither of them could see coming. As Black Sabbath's fame exploded, so did the chaos swirling around Ozzy Osbourne. At first, his wild behavior was part of the show, the offbeat comments, the unpredictable stage antics, the larger-than-life personality fans loved. But what the world saw as rock and roll madness, Tony Iommi began to see as something darker. The late nights got later, the drinking got heavier, and the drugs, they became a constant presence. Ozzy started missing rehearsals, showing up hours late, or stumbling in too intoxicated to sing a note. On stage, he could still command a crowd, but behind the scenes, his unpredictability was wearing everyone down. Some of his stunts became legendary, and not always in a good way. There was the night a fan threw a live bat on stage, and Ozzy bit its head off, not realizing what it was until it was too late. Another time, during a press event, he bit the head off a dove. Then there was the drug-fueled tour where he allegedly snorted a line of ants. And in between, he collected exotic animals, moved into a house rumored to be haunted, and joked about waiting for the ghosts to fetch him a beer to the public. It was outrageous rock star theater. To Tony, it was a ticking time bomb. As the band's creative leader, he was carrying the weight of writing music, managing direction, and holding it all together while Ozzy drifted further away. Every missed rehearsal, every off-night performance, every moment of tension in the studio chipped away at the chemistry that had made them great. The world saw Black Sabbath as untouchable. But behind closed doors, Tony could feel it. The foundation was starting to crack. And soon, it would all come crashing down. By 1979, the cracks in Black Sabbath were no longer hidden. They were gaping wounds. The music was suffering, the tours were tense, and the recording sessions felt like walking on glass. For Tony Iommi, the man who had helped build this band, from scratch, it was a nightmare. Ozzy's substance abuse had gone from wild excess to dangerous self-destruction. He was missing studio time entirely, forgetting lyrics mid-performance, and drifting further into a haze that no one could pull him out of. Creative disagreements piled on top of the personal chaos. Tony wanted to keep pushing the band sound forward, but Ozzy seemed disconnected, uninterested, and at times completely unreachable. It wasn't just the music, it was the friendship, the spark that had fueled their rise from the smoky pubs of Birmingham to the world's biggest arenas was fading fast, and Tony could feel the unthinkable looming. In the spring of 1979, the decision was made. Ozzy Osbourne was out of Black Sabbath. It wasn't done in anger. It wasn't revenge. It was survival. "We didn't hate him," Tony would later say. "We just didn't know how to help him anymore." But that didn't make it any easier. This wasn't just firing a singer. It was cutting loose someone he had grown up with, struggled alongside, and shared the impossible dream with. The fallout was immediate. The bond was shattered. Ozzy and Tony didn't speak for nearly 20 years. And though both would go on to make history in their own ways, that silence left a wound Tony would carry for decades. When the dust settled, most people assumed the split had ended both of their careers. But Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne weren't just survivors. They were fighters. And what happened next proved that neither man needed the other to make history. But they would always be connected. For Ozzy, the firing was a wake-up call and a challenge. Just 1 year later, in 1980, he roared back with Blizzard of Oz. The record wasn't just a success, it was a phenomenon. Tracks like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley became instant classics, powered by the virtuoso guitar work of his new creative partner, the young and brilliant Randy Rhoads. Together, they created something fresh, melodic, and ferocious. The momentum didn't stop. In 1981, Ozzy followed up with Diary of a Madman, cementing his place as a solo powerhouse. Fans who thought he'd fade away after Sabbath were forced to admit he was bigger than ever. Meanwhile, Tony refused to let Black Sabbath collapse. He brought in Ronnie James Dio as the new frontman, and in 1980, they released Heaven and Hell, a record that silenced every critic who thought Sabbath couldn't survive without Ozzy. The guitar work was razor-sharp, the energy revitalized, and the fans rallied behind the new era. A year later, Mob Rules proved it wasn't a fluke. Tony had kept the Sabbath name alive. For years, their paths never crossed. They toured the world, sold millions of albums, and built separate legacies. But no matter how far apart they were, there was an unspoken truth. The story of Tony and Ozzy wasn't finished. And when fate brought them back together, it would be bigger than anyone expected. It took nearly 2 decades for the walls between Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne to finally crack. The silence had lasted so long that many fans believed the original Black Sabbath lineup would never share a stage again. But in 1997, the impossible happened. Ozfest, what began as Ozzy's traveling metal festival, turned into the perfect stage for reconciliation. Behind the scenes, quiet conversations started. Old wounds were acknowledged. The anger had faded, replaced by something neither man wanted to admit. They had missed each other. That year, the original lineup, Ozzy, Tony, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, walked back on stage together. The crowd's roar was deafening, like the past 20 years had vanished in an instant. The chemistry was still there, raw and electric, as if time had only sharpened what they'd once had. The reunion sparked more than just a tour. In 1998, they released the live album Reunion, a thunderous reminder of why this lineup had become legendary in the first place. Years later, in 2013, they surprised fans again with 13, their final studio album, a haunting, heavy record that felt like a full-circle moment. But beyond the music, something far more important was happening. Tony and Ozzy were rebuilding what had been lost. They laughed backstage again. They swapped old stories. They stood side by side, not just as musicians, but as brothers finding their way back to each other. Yet even as the stage lights burned bright, a shadow lingered just beyond. Them, one that neither of them could outrun forever. For years, Ozzy Osbourne had been the unstoppable force, the man who could outsing exhaustion, outparty anyone in the room, and defy every prediction about his downfall. But by the 2000s, cracks began to show. The public caught glimpses of it in slowed movements, in moments where his voice faltered, or when he leaned a little heavier on those around him. Fans assumed it was the toll of decades in rock and roll. Few knew the real reason. In 2020, Ozzy revealed the truth that had been quietly shaping his life for nearly 2 decades. He had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease back in 2003. For almost 17 years, he'd kept it mostly hidden, performing, and touring through pain, stiffness, and fatigue that only grew worse with time. The disease wasn't his only battle. Years of injuries from stage falls and accidents left him struggling to walk. Rehab became part of his daily life, along with endless doctor visits and therapy sessions. Through it all, Tony Iommi stayed close. Sometimes his support was public, appearing at events, joining Ozzy in the studio. Other times it was quiet, hospital visits, late-night calls, words of encouragement when Ozzy doubted himself. Those closest to them say Tony became one of the few people who could still lift Ozzy's spirits when the weight of it all grew heavy. Even as his health declined, Ozzy refused to surrender. He talked often about one more show, one last chance to stand in front of his fans. And in the summer of 2025, that chance came. But no one could have guessed just how final it would be. July 5th, 2025, Birmingham, England, the city where it all began. The show was called Back to the Beginning, a fitting name for what would become the most emotional night in Black Sabbath's history. The arena was sold out hours before the doors opened. Fans from across the world poured in, wearing vintage Sabbath shirts, holding up signs, some even carrying vinyl copies of the band's earliest albums. Everyone knew this night was special, but few realized just how much. When the lights dimmed, the crowd erupted. And there, at center stage, was Ozzy Osbourne. Not pacing, not leaping, not headbanging like the madmen of decades past, but seated on a dark, ornate throne, framed by Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward. His voice cracked on the first song, but the power was still there, carried by sheer will. Every lyric felt heavier, every note drenched in nostalgia. The cameras caught moments when Ozzy would look over at Tony, and the two would exchange small, knowing smiles, the kind only brothers in arms could share. The setlist was a love letter to their beginnings. War Pigs, Iron Man, Paranoid. The crowd sang so loud, sometimes drowned out the band entirely. And when they reached the final song, Ozzy didn't give a speech, just a quiet dedication. This one's for all of you, and for where we began. The applause went on for minutes. Ozzy looked tired, but there was pride in his eyes. As they rolled him off stage, he reached out, grabbed Tony's hand, and whispered, "It went all right, didn't it?" Tony smiled back, his voice low but certain. "Yeah, mate, it really did." 17 days later, the world would understand why that night felt so final. On the morning of July 22nd, 2025, the news broke. Ozzy Osbourne had passed away at the age of 76, It was said to be peaceful, at home, with Sharon and their children by his side. But for millions of fans around the globe, it felt sudden, almost impossible to believe. Just over 2 weeks earlier, they had watched him sing, smile, and say goodbye in his own way. The shock was immediate. Within minutes, social media flooded with tributes. Hashtags like #ThankYouOzzy and #RestingPower trended worldwide. Rock stations cleared their schedules, playing Sabbath and Ozzy tracks back to back. In Birmingham, fans gathered. In the streets, lighting candles and blasting Paranoid through portable speakers. In Los Angeles, murals began appearing overnight, some from renowned street artists, others from ordinary fans with spray cans and grief in their hearts. But it wasn't just musicians who spoke out. Actors, athletes, even political figures shared stories of how Ozzy's music, or his spirit, had shaped them. From War Pigs to Crazy Train, his songs had become more than music. They were anthems, lifelines, soundtracks to entire generations. But for Tony Iommi, this was more than the loss of a rock legend. It was the loss of a brother, one he had fought with, laughed with, grown up with, and found his way back to after decades apart. And now, with the cameras rolling and the world listening, Tony was ready to share the truth about the man behind the myth. When Tony Iommi sat down for his first interview after Ozzy's passing, the room was quiet, almost reverent. At 77, his voice carried the weight of a lifetime. But in that moment, it was shaky, not from age, but from emotion. When I heard it, it just wouldn't sink in, he began softly. I'd just gotten a text from him the day before. We joked like we always did, and then suddenly, he was gone. It doesn't feel real. It still doesn't. For the next hour, Tony spoke about the Ozzy few ever saw, the man behind the backbiting, headlines, and the chaos of rock stardom. He talked about a friend who was generous to a fault, who quietly helped people without ever seeking credit. He recalled how Ozzy stood by Sharon during her cancer battle in 2002, never leaving her side through the treatments, and how he once arranged a surprise visit to a terminally ill fan, giving her what she called the best day of my life. Tony admitted that Ozzy had been a victim of his own fame, forced into a public role that exaggerated his wild side while burying his softer, truer self. He never really got to live a normal life, Tony said, eyes glistening. People expected him to always be Ozzy Osbourne, the madman. But the real Ozzy was kind, vulnerable. He cared deeply, even if he didn't always show it. Then, with a long pause, Tony spoke about their years apart after the 1979 split. I was angry. We all were. But deep down, I missed him every single day. When we finally made up, it was like a part of me came back. I thought we had more time. The last memory he shared was from their final show together. Ozzy, tired but smiling, had grabbed Tony's hand and asked, "It went all right, didn't it?" Tony smiled through tears. "Yeah, mate, it really did." With Ozzy gone, a legendary chapter in rock history had closed. The voice that helped create heavy metal was silent, but the echo of what he and Tony built still roared across the world. For Tony Iommi, the grief was deep, but so was his sense of purpose. In the weeks following Ozzy's passing, Tony began combing through a vast archive of unreleased Black Sabbath material. Old demos, alternate takes, and rare live recordings sat untouched in vaults for decades. Some were forgotten, even by the band's closest circle. Now, Tony wanted to share them with the world, not just as a tribute, but as a way to keep the raw, unfiltered spirit of Sabbath alive. That there were other plans too. Rumors began to swirl about a series of tribute concerts, not the typical tribute act fare, but all-star events featuring some of the biggest names in rock and metal, artists who had grown up idolizing Ozzy. Tony envisioned it as more than just music, "We're not just playing songs," he reportedly told an insider. "We're telling his story." Fans also began hearing about something even more personal, the possibility of a foundation in Ozzy's name to support Parkinson's. Research honoring the fight he waged quietly for so many years. For Tony, it was a way to ensure that Ozzy's name wouldn't just live on through his music, but through meaningful change. And then there was the memoir. Tony had been working on it for years, but now it would carry a deeper weight, the full story of how two kids from Birmingham changed music forever, lost each other, found their way back, and stood side by side until the very end. "We did something special," Tony said recently, "and it'll never die. He'll never die. Not in the music, not in the fans, not in me." The curtain had fallen on their final performance together, but the brotherhood of Tony Iommi and Ozzy Osbourne was eternal, etched into vinyl, carved into history, and alive in the hearts of millions. Let us know. What's the one Ozzy Osbourne moment, on stage or off, that will stay with you forever? Drop it in the comments, because I'd love to hear your stories. If you want more untold rock and roll legends, behind-the-scenes truths, and the stories the headlines never got right, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you never miss a video. The music lives on, and so does the story.